Hello, hello. I'm pleased to share with you this conversation with Dr Maddie Pelz, where we chat about the importance of everyday maths play in supporting very young children to develop the foundations required in those crucial years leading up to school. This conversation will be particularly valuable for any adults involved in the education of very young children, so aged 0 or 1 up to 5, 6, 7 years old. So, parents, legal guardians, education support staff, teachers, this is for you. If you're accessing the video version of this conversation, you'll notice a few times my light going out, and I have to thank Maddie for doing so well and not letting this distract from our conversation. Hopefully, it's not too distracting for you. I hope you enjoy the conversation. It goes for about 25 minutes. And if later on you're interested in accessing the Grow Into Math playbook, which we talk a bit about, you can use the code MathsPlay15 to get 15% off. You've got a PhD in early childhood learning.
Yeah, in cognitive development. Yep. Mm-hmm.
In cognitive development. Perfect. Mm-hmm. And can you clarify when you say it was in cognitive development, was it in cognitive development generally and then you funneled into mathematics? What's the story there?
That's a great question. Yeah. So my PhD was in a department called Brain and Cognitive Sciences. So it spanned pretty broadly from people doing molecular neuroscience research all the way to cognitive science. So my PhD was in a lab that studied play and learning more broadly. So people were asking questions about play, about curiosity, about even social interaction. So even within our lab, there was a lot of diversity. And then within that cognitive development lab, I studied specifically kids' intuitions about math and science concepts. So I was focused on early math and science, but within that play-based cognitive development lens. So I was asking questions about what intuitions kids bring to the table about, say, like a statistical reasoning concept before they learn any of that formally in school. So like, what does a 5-year-old think about statistical sampling or power analyses or things like that? So that was sort of my niche, was early math and science reasoning, but within that cognitive development umbrella.
Wow. I don't know too much about the unschooling movement, but I'm curious about your thoughts on this. I mentioned the teacher that I caught up with. We used to work together. She taught prep when I was in year 1 and now is working in kindergartens. And it was interesting because she said that in the space she's working in, the term school readiness, which is about preparing children, is being flipped to focus on child readiness, which is about preparing schools for children. Like ensuring that they're set up and run in ways that are inclusive and developmentally appropriate for all the children that are entering that new community. And I just wondered if you had any comments to make on it.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that sort of like flipped perspective. I think that's really interesting. I do hear a lot being in the early childhood on social media space. I do hear a lot of both sort of pressure on parents to make sure their child is ready, sometimes in the pursuit of selling things like, oh, you need this course or something, or you need this to make sure your child is ready for school, versus maybe educators feeling like that pressure is getting pushed lower and lower. So rather than, oh, kids learn to write their name or learn to start recognizing letters in kindergarten, parents are hearing, if your child's not ready to read immediately upon starting kindergarten, then they're behind, right? I do think that school readiness pressure gets pushed down younger and younger. So now it's like, oh, if your preschooler isn't doing this, then they're not ready. They're not going to be ready for kindergarten, and they'll be behind the whole rest of school. So I do think that pressure is trickling down. But I also am hesitant to say, oh, all academics can wait until kids start school, because research also tells us that, especially for math, that just isn't true. But that doesn't mean your child needs to start doing worksheets when they're 3, right? What we all talk about is, it means incorporating math in playful ways. It means learning through play. It means learning through connection with your family at home and finding those everyday ways to promote learning rather than that academic pressure. So I think it's interesting to separate being ready to meet those milestones when you're entering school and feeling like you have the background from your everyday experiences to feel ready for that, versus your child needs to be like acing the tests, getting the questions right on the worksheet, that sort of school readiness. So it kind of gets tricky because I think people mean a lot of different things for it. But I love the idea of schools making sure they're ready for their students, because no matter what we think is ideal for school readiness, kids are definitely coming in with really varied levels. And those do follow them through school. So it is important that we pay attention to that and try to make sure that kids are catching up if they need to. That was sort of a long answer, but I love the idea of schools thinking of it as their responsibility rather than putting it on parents and saying that, you need to make sure your child is up to some certain standard before they're ready to start.
I'd love to know if there was something you think everyone should know about mathematics itself, the subject, the discipline, what would that be?
Yeah, I was thinking about this after you sent it over. I think because I'm coming from the perspective of quite young kids engaging with math, this is actually related to what we've been talking about. But I think for me, one of the most important things is that I think a lot of adults, especially adults with math anxiety and who've had negative experiences with math, think about math as like a fixed trait that is measurable through your memorized math facts, like whether you know your times tables, whether you can fill out those worksheets in a minute, all of that. And I think what feels really important to me is to communicate that math is really about creativity and flexible problem solving and curiosity. So, really, that like flexibility and creativity. And I think that's what gets taken out of math when we focus too much on memorization and on performance. So, that's my high level answer to that question.
I love the way you described that. Thank you. I also wanted to know what you think everyone should know about learning maths. You've already nudged on it with your first answer
Yeah,
about mathematics itself, but could you talk a little bit more about the learning process?
totally. I mean, I have so much to say about how math is learned because I am so focused on introducing essentially infants who they do bring a lot, but from the very beginning. But I think one thing that I sort of have a soapbox about is that it feels like the perspective on early literacy is that reading together can be this cozy, connecting, positive, joyful family experience. So society has accepted that reading together is really good for kids. It's this positive, fun thing. And then math is like, that's scary, that's for school. And so, what I would say in terms of math learning is that math learning can be something that's cozy and connecting and for families to do together that's joyful. And I would encourage people to reevaluate how they see early math and think about learning math similar to learning how to read, that it can really happen in a joyful play-based experience. And I can talk about specific examples of that, but
Yeah, that would be great,
yeah.
actually. Paint a picture for us.
Yeah, totally. It really depends on the child, but I think that's part of what's fun about it is that no matter what your child's naturally drawn to, you can really build on that and incorporate meaningful math into that. So, if your child loves pretend play, opening a pretend restaurant, creating a menu, talking about how much things cost, following recipes, those have fractions and numbers and counting and bringing together each of those things. If your child loves building with blocks, how can you talk about comparing heights, talking about counting? How can you build things? How can you talk about shape and spatial reasoning? No matter what kids are interested in, there's always deep math. And if you build a math mindset, I call it, where if you're always looking for ways you might sprinkle in more joyful math, it's really already there in what you're doing with your kids. And then that's true in the classroom as well. It's really just about highlighting it and that sort of like feedback loop of kids are playing, you're talking about math, they realize there's math in what they're enjoying math. It's a positive feedback loop. And then they also start to point out math in what they're doing and spontaneously talk about math as well. One research term I really love is SFON. Are you familiar with SFON?
No.
So SFON, spontaneous focus on numerosity. So that's just a simple measure of if your child is playing, if you're talking together, how often are they spontaneously bringing up math concepts? And so what's interesting about that is the more that you add math talk to their experience, the more likely they are to bring it up themselves. So that just creates this great loop of they're noticing math, they're getting more experience, they're seeing it in their everyday lives, they're feeling positive and confident about it. And that can really snowball into kids really building their math skills and their math confidence. So we want to really be like modeling that math mindset, and kids are really going to pick up on that and reflect it back to us in ways that are really helpful for them too.
That makes so much sense. I just have to watch the way my 2-year-old niece just wants to do everything that you're doing. Every time I come and visit, she'll go and get the fluffy dice that I've given her. Or go and get I think it's that social connection, isn't it, that really drives
totally.
a lot of this. It's like, I want to be like you, or I want to be a part of this community that you're leading as one of the adults in my life.
It's fun that you're the math person in her life. She goes, "Oh, it's Alex. It's time to do math." I love that. That social element is so important, and I think that's one other thing that I think is really important is that it doesn't need to be like math time, right? It doesn't need to be we sit down, it's 30 minutes, we're doing a math activity. It can be all day, right? It can be we're brushing our teeth, let's sing a counting song. We're walking down the street, we're pointing out the shapes that we see, right? Math talk is something that you can do consistently and easily. It does maybe take some practice to learn how to see those opportunities, but it's not something you need to force or set aside time for. It really is already part of your day. So it sounds cheesy, but like math is everywhere is really true. And so it's really just highlighting that for kids and having them recognize the math that's already part of the things that they love too.
We talked before how culturally we seem to have this value that's placed on reading and sharing books together. And we have, I think, this general understanding that that is a good educational thing to do, because we know that over time, that's supporting their literacy. We're not expecting them to read the books with us, but we know that eventually they will begin to read, because they will have all these repeated exposures to the language and the stories that's going to support that. And we don't really have that equivalent for mathematics. And
that belief,
over time, if we play with and notice stuff and play games regularly, that's actually going to contribute to academic outcomes. Can you speak a little bit to whether that's sort of equivalent experience in mathematics is tied to supporting academic outcomes? Is there sort of evidence of that?
It is definitely, definitely. There's, I would say, decades of research, which is part of why it's hard to see on the scale that it is, especially, I mean, in the US and also around the world, that it really isn't being picked up in the same way that literacy is by families and even in schools. But definitely early math, early counting, early math input, early math talk, hearing positive things about math helps kids avoid math anxiety. And there's, early math at school entry. So 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds. There was a study by Duncan 2007 where they did this huge meta-analysis of all of these different measures at school entry and then followed kids through middle school and tried to see what the most important sort of predictors of their academic success were. And early math ability at school entry was the most predictive thing, even beyond literacy. So it predicted both math and literacy success, even beyond early literacy. It's interesting because, of course, those things interact. And when you're talking about math, you're also using words and you're building concepts, and it's all interconnected. But yes, early math matters a ton. And how they enter school really does follow them through, even into like career choice. So we know that early math is super important. And despite that, it just really still isn't happening. And I think a lot of that is because of adult math anxiety. So I work with a lot of teachers, I work with a lot of families, and even after we do a long professional development day where we get people excited, we do math games, we do this, sometimes you still hear from people, oh, but it's just preschool. Oh, but they're only 3 years old. Oh, it's too early. I don't want to put pressure. And it really doesn't have to be pressure. The option isn't stressing your child out with worksheets and memorization and pressure, or wait until school. Those aren't the only options, right? You can play, you can read books and talk about the math, you can count together, you can play games. So we know it matters, and there's a lot of ways to do it that aren't stressful. And I think that's just a perspective shift that we're trying to get out to teachers and families, that even if math makes you feel anxious, there's a lot of ways that you can heal that and also help prevent it in the kids that you interact with by focusing on play and joyful interactions.
I want to talk about this again a little bit, if you don't mind. So
sure.
I've loved accessing your Grow Into Math course, and I know that there's still a lot more for me to explore. I'm in the final module of the little mini lessons, and I've already been able to access some and play around with some of the suggested games and activities along the way. You've created that for parents to use with what's the age range that you'd say it's targeted for?
I would say 2 to 5-year-olds. So more of the advanced games would maybe be for the older kids who are getting closer to starting preschool. But so much of it you can start when kids are really young. So around 2 years old, I would say. At least then you have the information as you can see your child moving through those stages. Yeah.
Can you give us a little bit of a summary of the whole thing that you've put together?
Yes, definitely. So the idea was to structure in ways that are easy to digest. So short, small, informative videos to take parents and teachers through the main skills that kids are building towards becoming confident math learners. So it starts with pre-counting skills, things like subitizing, things like making hand shapes, being able to practice counting out loud, just taking you through what a very young child could do in terms of adding math talk and increasing that exposure. Then we talk about counting skills. So even though counting seems like a basic skill, it really can be broken down into a lot of different skills that build on each other and need to come together for kids to be successful counters. And that essentially ends or gets tied up with the idea of cardinality, which is super important and the basis of kids then being able to think of numbers as concepts. So the idea is that once you count a set, you know that the number that you get to is the same as the total. And that's a really important concept for kids to understand, because if you say the number 3, we want kids to really be thinking about 3 objects rather than just 3 as a symbol.
I loved one of the little lessons on cardinality.
So yeah, cardinality, as kids are learning the real meaning of each number, what they're doing is they're actually building those concepts one at a time. So first, they can understand that 1, if you ask them to give you 1 of something, they can hand you 1. But if you ask them to hand you 2, they might just push over a pile of something. So essentially, they have that concept of 1, they've built that, but then 2 essentially means the same as many. So I kind of think of it as like a chart where 1 has become like this sharp concept, and then 2 is like this broad into many. 2 is the same as 7 is the same as 15. Like it just means not 1 and more than 1 typically.
It's more, yeah.
So that kid would be called a 1 knower. Then when they get more experience with creating sets, counting sets, hearing you count sets and emphasize the cardinality, they become a 2 knower. So they would be able to hand you 1 if you ask for 1. And then they learn what that concept of 2 means, that sort of like 2-ness of 2. So they can hand you 2 of something. But then 3 means the same as many. And so they're building those concepts one by one with a lot of repeated exposure and practice.
Then it gets to 6, right?
It's like so it's really interesting because, and it's really hard to find in development these specific measurable like stair steps of learning. Like almost never do you say like, oh, now this child understands the letter E, right? You can see hints of that in things like literacy, but it really is like a rare case where you can really see those concepts being sharpened one at a time. And it's really amazing. You can like retest a child and you see that they still could only give you 3, and then you retest them again in a month or something. Now they're a 4 knower, right? So it's really interesting. You can see those changes happening. And as a parent or as a teacher, it's really interesting and fun to see kids move along that trajectory. But yes, like you're saying, they learn 1, they learn 2, they learn 3, they learn 4, they learn 5, but it's actually really rare to find a 6 knower, because what happens is they've learned each of those concepts, and then I think of it as like a conceptual leap. They say, oh, wait a second. I know the count list. I know that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I've memorized that song, right? Like those are symbols. Those are just sort of lyrics almost, I think about it. Those aren't necessarily number concepts, but they know that string of numbers. They know how to count out loud. They've slotted their concepts of number into those first few numbers up to 5. And then they say, wait a minute, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I have those concepts. Now I can understand that when I move up 1 number in my count list, so I go from 5 to 6, that set of 5 objects is going to get another number thrown in. And now that's a set of 6 objects. And they just have this light bulb moment, which I don't know that we actually know that kids wake up one day and they're like, wow, it's n+1. Now I know cardinality. But it is, instead of becoming a 6 knower and a 7 knower and an 8 knower, right? It's really rare to find kids that can give you a set of 7 but not 8, for example. They really become what we call a CP knower, the cardinal principle knower, that as you add 1 into your count list, you're also adding 1 to your set. And so that really opens up kids' understanding of number itself, because before you understand that, if you say, for example, what's bigger, 5 or 3? They might be able to count up and say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 3 came before, so it's smaller. But really being able to picture those sets or understand those sets is really a precursor to understanding comparing number, adding number, moving along the number line, really any sort of meaningful calculation or use of number. So that's really something we want to see for kids, by kindergarten, or just by the time that we're really expecting them to do any of those computations with number. We really want to make sure that those have meaning to them. And oftentimes it doesn't. And then we're going to see a lot of confusion when we say, what's 3 plus 2? And those numbers aren't concepts to kids. So we really want to make sure that's in place before we move forward. I'd love to mention that in addition to those video modules, there's also a game library. So I think that's really helpful for parents, that if people are looking for, okay, now I understand what subitizing is, but I also wanted people to feel like they could immediately put it into action. So there's also a bunch of ways where you can say, I'm interested in a subitizing game I can play without needing any materials. And you can filter through the game library and get a lot of options of ways to add that to your everyday play. So I think that's a really powerful part of the course, is that I love that you said you feel sort of like empowered with that information, but you can put it into action right away, which I think is really important for parents and teachers that are looking for ways to get it going quickly.
One other thing I wanted to mention that I enjoyed was the way that you have little assessment milestones. You mentioned earlier testing whether they're a 3 knower or whatever. And it
Yeah.
made me think to these little assessment games that you have.
Mm-hmm.
And I really love that each assessment is some sort of playful activity where you're engaging in a two-way conversation or activity or game. And the purpose of that is for you to see what the child already knows and can do, and get a sense of where they're at and what they need repeated practice around. I know that a lot of teachers are looking for developmental appropriate ways in prep and year one,
sort of like,
to be
like
assessing
formative assessments.
students.
Yeah. I think too that not only does it make it feel more fun for the kid, a lot of times when we do simple assessments, if you ask a child like, what's 3 + 2, or what number is missing from this range, you're not really getting to the concept that might be missing. So for example, a child might answer that question incorrectly, but do you know if it's because they don't know the order of the count list, or they don't know the concept underlying it? Or so what I was trying to do is design activities in a way where you can really understand the conceptual answer. So if they answer this way, this might point to their understanding, or if they answer this way, that might suggest they really need to go back a few steps and build up from there, to give parents a chance to not just know that they know this or they don't know this and I'm ready to move on, but also if they get it incorrect, where that confusion might be coming from, or how they might be able to bolster that concept more.
How important would you say that having concrete manipulatives and visuals is in that process? You have a lot in your activities. Would you say it's a critical aspect of any sort of assessment with that kind of age?
For the assessment specifically, I think for early math, crucial. I think for assessment, I would say it's really helpful. I think that's just another way for kids to be able to sort of externalize their internal thought process. So if you're trying to understand what concepts kids understand, if you're trying to understand where they are in the development of a particular skill, I think it is really important that you offer maybe not even just one type of way for them to explain it, but some kids will be able to explain it with words. Some might be able to sort of show you visually. I had a really interesting experience with one of the kids that I was filming some videos with, where she couldn't really explain to me. I'm trying to remember exactly what happened. So she was building towers. We were rolling dice and building the tower based on what number we rolled. And she started spontaneously putting them in order. So she had a tower with 2 blocks, a tower with 3 blocks, and then a tower with 5 blocks. And there was one missing, and she had left a gap for it. And I don't think she could have told me. She couldn't really put it into words why she had left a gap, but she was like, well, I have 2 and 3, and then there's something more that needs to go here, and then I have the next one. So I could see that she understood conceptually that there was a stair step missing in between. But if we hadn't had those blocks, I wouldn't have been able to see that, even though she couldn't maybe explain that she was sorting them by order and that she knew that 4 was missing, she was able to demonstrate that understanding. So having those blocks and the physical representation gave me a window into her thought process that I otherwise think I wouldn't have understood.
Well, thank you for giving up your time to have this chat. I always learn from you, and I love following you on Instagram. And now I'm a formal student, having enrolled in the Growing Through Math program. Just to finish up, I did want to mention that the International Day of Maths is coming up in March on Friday the 14th. And last year, the celebrations were around the global theme of playing with mathematics. This year, the theme is mathematics, art, and creativity. And I just wondered if there was a resource or an activity or an idea that you could share or play forward to us or celebrating this theme.
Yeah, definitely. So I love crafts. And so I love designing math crafts and art experiences for young kids to use as like a jumping off point for math talk and math play. So I have a specific activity I could suggest, which is always fun. What I love doing is cutting out different sizes and colors of different shapes and doing sort of like a shape collage. And what that does is it sparks so much great math talk where kids will say, "Oh, can you hand me the biggest blue circle?" So they're naming shapes, they're comparing sizes, they're building things. There's a lot of great spatial reasoning where if kids want to design an animal or make a robot or something, they're really thinking about how they're building those shapes, sort of like tangram blocks, which are really fun. There's a lot of spatial reasoning, there's subitizing, there's all of these great skills. So I really love incorporating those visuals and those like hands-on crafts for math play.
Oh, I love
Does that
that.
make
So,
sense? That's a very
yes, that
specific game,
sounds,
but
I really want to do that.
it's always a hit. It's always a hit, and it's very open-ended. There's no right or wrong way to do it, but as an adult working together with the child, you can really spark a lot of really great conversations about, oh, I love that you put those two triangles together that way and now it looks like a square, right? You can talk about all these different part-whole relationships. It's really a great open-ended conversation starter that is a great way to incorporate math and creativity.
That sounds like a winner, and the only preparation I imagine is just a bit of
Just
colored
cutting
paper.
up some shapes.
Shapes.
Yeah, exactly. I love a low prep activity. Yeah, kids could cut it themselves too. You could ask them too, can you make 3 small circles? I want to use those. And you can sort of order some different shapes.
Thank you so much for your time today. It's
Yeah,
been
of
really
course.
fun.
Thank you. This was super fun. I appreciate you having me.